Hi everyone, this is Allan McKay and welcome to episode 16. This is going to be great. We're going through building a brand, building and defining a name for yourself, and more associating yourself with a niche inside the industry. So what I want to do is I want to go through a lot of content specifically to this. I think it's a very powerful subject and one that I know there's a lot of confusion about. I get a lot of email asking about questions like, should I do everything or should I focus and have a niche? So this is something I think will be very valuable for a lot of people.
Welcome to the Allan McKay podcast. Allan is an Emmy Award-winning visual effects artist and mentor to many leading industry experts. Listen in as Allan talks with other industry leaders in film, video games, and visual effects about their experience, lessons, and methodology. Allan will teach you pivotal advice to fast-track your career, better your skills, and reach your ultimate dream job. Check out the latest episodes on allanmckay.com.
Okay, so I'm going to dive into this right now, and this is going to be hopefully a short episode. I want to try and keep on point. There's obviously the last couple episodes been a lot of information I've been trying to cram in, and with this one I want to kind of stick to one subject, which is going to be specifically about building your brand. Now, this is something that's kind of a bit of a buzzword now, the same way that I hear about introverts and extroverts all the time. Obviously, those terms have existed forever, but now they're a lot more commonly used, as are many of these. But one thing that you'll hear a lot in marketing as well as do with freelancing is going to be about, you got to build your brand, or you are a big brand. I've heard that a lot in the past year especially. Now, I do think that it actually is a very important thing to have. It's just a matter of how you see it and also how you perceive it. Now, by definition, or more importantly, what we're talking about when we say your brand is essentially how people are going to perceive you, what they think of when they hear your name. Now, this is very important, and I've mentioned this in other episodes about getting a job and getting in the industry, moving up in the industry. When you go for a job at, let's say, a big studio or whatever, when you initially announce to them, "Hi, I'm Keith, I do this." Now, if you just say I'm a 3D guy and I do 3D or whatever, you're essentially going to fall into miscellaneous. In other words, people won't know how to place you. And this is something that I find all the time. I meet a lot of people who introduce themselves as so-and-so, and either they don't say what they are. And again, you're more than a title, but if you don't define who you are, something about you, then you are going to kind of fall away or fall to the wayside a little bit, because you want something that people will initially associate you with. And the real power of that is because that way when they think of that item you're associated with, they'll think of you. And that's very powerful. I'll give a quick example would be, let's say that I'm making this up on the spot. Let's say you're a sculptor, a ZBrush sculptor, and you do dragons. Okay, good buddy of mine, Dan Catcher, who created all the dragons for Game of Thrones. He's a good friend of mine, and there's anyone who knows him, there's definitely other things you could associate with him, but definitely you think Dragon Guy. He's the guy who did the dragons for Game of Thrones. Those are the sort of things that you want. Like, I've got a buddy of mine, Paul Kerwin, who's I think he's a visual effects supervisor at Digital Domain these days, but I knew him about 20 years ago, and he always had the nickname Titanic Boy because he worked on Titanic, and we had some clients from Japan who are over, and they kind of dubbed him that name, and it kind of stuck. But they made up that name because they associated him with Titanic. He worked on Titanic in LA, and moved back to Sydney for a while and got that. Since then, he's worked on everything from Lord of the Rings through to literally everything. But that's obviously the big project that stuck, and he kind of had that name for the longest time. But the thing is that you can have negative and you can have positive associations. Obviously you don't want to be, that guy was the guy sleeping on the job or whatever. Obviously you want to have stuff that you can always associate positively. And the thing is that you don't need to get nicknames from a client to make them stick. You can define who you are. And if you define yourself, people are going to associate you with that definition. If you don't, then it goes in the fuzzy world of whatever you get associated with. In other words, if you say, I am a real flow guy. I do water simulations, whatever. I've worked on this, this, and this. Suddenly, you're the water guy. People are going to think of you. They're like, oh, we need to get a water guy. We can reach out to so-and-so and see if he's available because I know that he's done all these big productions doing water. Okay, so again, none of this, I try and make most of the content that I talk about here not specific to visual effects, but if you're in other areas and you stumble upon this podcast, this stuff applies to you no matter what you're in. So whether you're the LinkedIn ninja for marketing and you're the networking guru, whatever it's going to be, you can be really good at job boards and making connections with other people. But the thing is, if you don't know how to define yourself, nobody else is going to know how to define you either. So it's very important that you figure out what the heck you are. In fact, I read an amazing article on, I'm going off script here, but Harvard Business Report the other day about exactly this subject, and I'll try and dig it up at some point because this is exactly what I'm talking about. In fact, Harvard Business Review, what business are you in? Classic advice from Theodore Levitt. Now, that's a great article I just thought of now because it actually is kind of similar to what I'm covering here, which essentially is you might think that you're in 3D. Okay, you might think you're in visual effects. But let's say you're working with a lot of studios that are doing a lot of game cinematics and you keep getting invited out to all the game parties. A lot of these studios know you for doing game stuff. Maybe you're better to define yourself as you're the interactive cinematics or game cinematics guy rather than being I work in feature film, because if most of your clients are actually in game cinematics, then when you say feature film, they're going to disassociate you. In other words, they're going to say, okay, well, you don't apply to me, I can't connect the dots. But if you say game cinematics, they're going to be like, and suddenly those dots will get connected. And opportunities may come up, and it mightn't be right away. And that's one of the reoccurring themes that I talk about here is about building those long-term relationships. So down the line, and this has happened to me plenty of times, where finally they're like, hey, you know what? We've got this game cinematic coming up. We wanted to talk to you about assembling a team, or we wanted to see if you wanted to pitch in on a bid for this. So there's lots of opportunities, but by defining a clear definition of who you are and what you do, it means that it's clear to them. If you don't know who you are and what you do, then nobody else is, I guarantee you. And one of the hardest things, like I always say about setting goals, one of the hardest things to do is actually have that initial direction. Most people struggle to actually figure out what they want to do, where they want to go, and they just kind of go with the flow, and they don't really have those goals, so they can't really measure their success. So if you're able to sit down and figure out ultimately what you want, then you can go after it. And the same thing, you need to figure out who you are, so that way other people can go after your goals for you as well. So that is a very important and key aspect here, is to know exactly what you are, what game are you actually playing in. So the Harvard Business Review article from Theodore Levitt is actually a really good example where you need to really not only figure out who you are and what you want to be, but you also need to figure out what business you're actually in, because you might think that you're in feature films and you keep saying feature films, you might be doing a lot of TV. And it's not to be embarrassed by, okay, well, I want to be doing feature films, so therefore I don't want to, mention I do TV. For me, and again, I guess a couple of these episodes I'm being as brutally honest as I can, something I've learned in the last year was that I think, even though I've done this my entire career, I was lecturing at university level in my teens, in my very late teens, but I was still a teenager when I was actually lecturing at a bachelor level, teaching visual effects, teaching IT, game development. And all of those subjects for me were pretty big, but I also, as I progressed, I was always kind of embarrassed by teaching. I didn't want to be associated with it. It's a big part of my life. I've mentored a lot of people at this point. I'd almost dare say thousands, but I have gone through a lot. I've definitely made it a big part of my life. I've enjoyed it, but I've also never wanted to be associated with it. I didn't like the idea of saying, okay, you teach, you're a mentor, you do speaking, you do all that stuff. Like, for me, it's always about, I want my work to speak for who I am. And it's only been really recently that I've kind of realized that a lot of the negative associations I have about about that is something that I really should be embracing, because it's something I love doing. And I always hear the term like those who can't do teach, and I've always kind of even thought that myself, just some views I've had on universities, other things like that. However, that is definitely a bit of a bullshit statement, because those who are really good at what they do want to teach other people, want to share their information. And I constantly give away information that I learn or techniques that I develop, because I want other people to develop themselves. I don't want to hold them all in and be one of those people that are tight-lipped and not wanting to share anything, and I do experience those people who, you ask them like, wow, like that was really great, how do you do it? And they're like, I'm not going to tell you, like, why would I give away my secrets? I don't get that. I think it's a really negative mindset to have. And ultimately, the more you share, the more you help others. I think that the more you give back, the more fulfilling it's going to be, and ultimately I think the more rewarding it's going to be for yourself. So that's definitely something I stick by. And so it's only been more recently I've started to kind of embrace that and realize, like, this is actually something I enjoy doing. I still work my ass off and I do lots of high-end productions, but I'm also spending and devoting a lot of time to helping others with their careers and getting all the emails, especially over Christmas. The amount of emails I've gotten from even just a couple of the episodes I put out where people I know have gotten promoted to supervisor level, have gotten major job offers that have changed their career. I've also gotten people who have gotten their first job ever, and this is actually, 10, 20, about 20 people, I think, have gotten their first job, and it's actually been at really major studios, which blew my mind, and it's all because of certain things that they applied over the December month, which again is awesome that a lot of you are actually applying this information from that month, because that's all what it was about, was gearing up for 2015 with all the knowledge, all the tools in front of you to do what you set out to do, to hit those goals, to succeed. Now, having applied all that and hit those goals, that to me is fulfilling. That's something exciting. Now, finding where you are and how you want to define yourself is very important. It's very crucial to getting you to hit those marks, to get those goals. Now, moving forward, I think it's very important here to, once you've defined who you are, figure out sound bites for it. I hate the term elevator pitch, because you hear that all the time, like, what's your elevator pitch? Meaning, what's your 15 seconds to describe who you are? However, I still think it's very important to lock down who you are and kind of figure out, by definition, how you would describe yourself, because otherwise what's going to happen is people say, what do you do for a living? And, you're either going to say like, well, I do movies and this, and it's very vague kind of description, or I'm a recruiter and, whatever, and not necessarily hit the points that you want, because you want to hit an emotional spike with those people that really resonates. Now, if you're able to figure that out and, really spend some time on it, spend a day, half a day, a few hours figuring out like what that is, talk to yourself, talk in front of the mirror, whatever it's going to be, but figure out how you would identify yourself, how you would introduce yourself at parties, or when someone asks, what do you do? I think it's very important, because that way you can find that moment that's going to really capture their attention and really make it store in their head that guy does this. It was really interesting talking to him, rather than, I forget his name, he did something to do with multimedia or whatever. You want to make it crystal clear who you are and some of your achievements. So not a 15-second elevator pitch, but be clear about who you are. So if someone asks me, what do you do? A lot of the times in the past, I've always said I'm unemployed, just because I didn't want to go through the whole talk about, oh, you just worked on The Last Samurai, or you just worked on Lord of the Rings, or you just did this, this, and this. I wanted to just kind of boycott that all and just kind of get accepted as me. And, it's kind of been fun to goof around with that, but if I'm actually talking in a business sense, I'm not going to tell like a future employer that I'm unemployed. It's more to do with like if I'm at a bar or whatever. I don't want to try and sound like I'm talking myself up. But if I'm talking to an employer, that's a whole other thing. And to downplay yourself actually will make you look less confident. It's actually going to make you look like, okay, well, he's not very confident in himself. You're not really going to resonate. You're not going to boost their confidence of thinking that you're good at what you do. Downplaying yourself is not a good thing. And a lot of people do that. They always think that, okay, I don't want to sound cocky, so I'm not going to say like I'm the best guy out there. But what they do instead is they're like, oh, I just do the 3D stuff, And what's going to happen is they're like, well, what have you worked on? It's like nothing important. Okay, so where are you going to lead with that? How are you going to leave an impression? Being cocky is one thing, but I'd almost think being cocky is almost better than being negative and trying to make yourself out to sound like to undervalue yourself. So I think it's important to really lock down how you approach it, but sell yourself. You don't need to oversell, but sell yourself. Say, oh, I'm a visual effects supervisor. I work in Hollywood. I just wrapped up working on The Equalizer and a couple other projects this year. I was actually working on the big end sequence of The Equalizer, blowing everything up as Denzel walks away looking all cool. That is a cool soundbite. That's, again, I'm just kind of going with the flow here, but you get the idea. That's something that's going to be like, oh, cool, yeah, you blow stuff up for a living. That's so cool. You worked on that Denzel film. Whatever you want, like whatever you want to throw out there, it's something to make it stick and to define you to them. Now, you can work on a few really solid sound bites, and that's really powerful. There's a book called Brag, and the subheading is How to Toot Your Own Horn Without Blowing It, and it's written by Peggy Klaus. And I spoke to her recently about this, and it's basically is a book that I really enjoyed reading, about 8-9 years ago, and it was just something that was about self-promotion, about not underselling yourself, and I thought that was a very valuable book that I do recommend checking out because it will help you reevaluate how you approach a lot of your introductions, how you hold yourself, because every moment you have with people, like I always say about creating opportunities, you are in a position to create an opportunity, and the long-term relationships, you're in a position to build that long-term relationship, therefore that long-term opportunity. So the more people you meet, the more you're able to define yourself in any situation to resonate with them. It's very crucial. So if I meet people, I know they're from video games, I'm not necessarily going to say, I worked on a Denzel film. I might say that, okay, well, yeah, I actually just wrapped up on Halo, working on the cinematics for that. I actually also VFX supervised the Destiny cinematics, and I'm not sure how much I can say about this, but I'm actually advising on the new Call of Duty. So, those are things that I can say, and those are things that are going to stick. So suddenly they're going to say, wow, okay, well, 3 of the biggest titles ever developed, or at least in the past couple of years, those are things that are going to stick with them, and they're going to say, wow, this is someone I need to get to know, or whatever it's going to be. Now, those are very important, just to kind of figure out where you can fit your credentials in that will fit and align with what will resonate with them. So again, TV commercials, I might say again that, okay, well, yeah, I work on commercials from time to time. I actually won a Pro Max in New York a couple of years ago. We got gold for a TV ident that we did. I also did the God of War God of War commercial for the Super Bowl, which you've probably seen, which everyone's seen that. It's awesome. But by saying stuff that aligns with them and knowing your pitch for them, it isn't about trying to win them over or be fake. It's about making stuff resonate with them and make their gears start to churn or connect the dots, so that way they say, wow, you know what, like, we're actually doing a commercial right now, and I don't know if we need any visual effects, but that'd be so cool if, like, maybe you want to come by and check it out. You can offer some suggestions. You come in, talk to them. Maybe it isn't a visual effects project, but you've made that connection, you've put in the time, and you've pre-qualified yourself, so that way when they actually do get that visual effects project, you're going to be the first person that they actually reach out to. So these are all things to keep in mind. It's always about, the whole term, always be hustling. You need to always be on your game. You need to think with a more of a business mindset, so that way you can really hit on all the things that you need. So I think it's very important to always have that mindset. So that is very crucial, is to have that defined. Now, at the same time, one thing I'll also mention is, when you are making the introduction, you want to make it go niche, go deep. So I'll give an example with me, and this isn't something I did intentionally, but I worked with the developers in 3ds Max for Fume Effects, and I got to use that before anyone else. I got very familiar with it. I started using it for a lot of productions. I got a pretty well-established name in Fume Effects, and it got to a point where, you type in Fume Effects, my name would be coming up, at the very top of the Google rankings and everything else, unintentionally, but bit by bit, I got put into the circle of you're the fire guy. Now, because of that, a lot of opportunities started coming up. Now, for me, I look at that like, I almost look at it negatively because it's like you're going very specific, but it also means that if you associate yourself with something that is popular and you manage to stand out, people are going to associate you with that, meaning that if they need something, you're going to be the go-to guy or the go-to girl for that thing. So keep that in mind, that it's very important to go niche, because initially you can associate yourself with that thing. So with Fume Effects, obviously I do a lot more than that. I use Houdini, I use Maya, I use Max. I don't do as much 3D stuff these days. I work on set. I do a lot of different stuff, and obviously podcast, all that kind of stuff. But that is something that I initially got associated with. I built my name up in that, and once I'm comfortable with that, I can step away and be able to move on to another niche and start to focus on that. And just by having that association, I was suddenly fire guy. I went to ILM expecting to be, a nobody there. I mean, the guys there are brilliant, and I'm expecting to be a small fish in a massive, massive pond of freaking ninjas. Okay. And what shocked me was that I had probably 8 people maybe on my first day come up to me individually just to say, hey, so psyched to have you here. Like, you're that fire guy. Like, yeah, like, I can't wait to see what you can do. And just to be associated over and over and over, like even there as being the fire guy. Rhythm and Hues and a couple other studios like Blizzard have, I've spoken with them about their pipelines and about what they do. And I remember R&H at one point, they were looking at setting up like a rogue fire department because it was the one area that they hadn't really gotten a massive grasp on, whereas water and everything else they had nailed to a T. So I ended up talking with them, which was really exciting, about opportunities and about designing an actual department specifically around fume effects. Now, you're going to get a lot of those opportunities come up just by defining yourself in a niche. People will associate you with that, and from there, things grow. Now, obviously, not everyone's going to be in the same position, but trust me, you will have all these opportunities start to arise the more you associate yourself with that. So if you were to go in and say, I'm a 3D guy or I'm a generalist, that's not really going to help you, because where or how are they going to categorize you? Like, what are they going to do if they're like, okay, well, you do 3D, congratulations. If you say, I am a photoreal lighter, I typically work with cars, so I do a lot of car commercials doing like photorealistic cars that you will see in all the commercials where you think it's a actual shot car, but we digitally replace the older model with the new model. Going specific means that people will say, great, you know what, like, we're actually doing a car commercial. We know someone, or wow, you do cool stuff. Like, we have a question later on when stuff comes up, or people they talk to, they're going to say, hey, I actually met someone who does that stuff. And maybe it's for a feature, maybe it's for a print ad, whatever it's going to be. Maybe it's for a helicopter. It doesn't need to be for cars, but they're going to associate you with that. The more information you give them, and you give it to them in layman's terms, in other words, don't try and sound really technical, because I meet people who definitely do try and like impress everyone by saying stupid shit, okay? Saying like, oh, well, I am a procedural animation crowd simulation guru, or whatever whatever it's going to be, okay? So the whole point is that by doing something like that, and I see this a lot, it won't resonate, okay? People are not going to make that association. Even if they understand what the freaking hell you're talking about, it's not going to stick with them. I actually will give an example of someone I know who is an amazing artist, but defined herself as, her passion, what she does a lot of portraits of, is, gorgeous models, stuff like that. So she would define herself as, I create rendered beauties. Now, I only mention that because it's something that, I had a big discussion about, just because, in my opinion, that isn't going to resonate. And I wanted to point that out, that sounds really cool, and it's good to have that catch line if you want to use that somewhere, but to use that to introduce yourself and define yourself in that one line, like if it's on Instagram or wherever, LinkedIn, is not going to be enough. And I see this a lot too with other people who put something really cool down as their title in LinkedIn, when it's really valuable real estate they should be using to catch someone who's just browsing through and they see that line and it's like, oh, you're exactly what we want. So it's important to use like searchable keywords and to use like, I create rendered beauties, for instance. That sounds really cool. And people who know you are going to get it. They're going to go, oh, okay, yeah, she does do that. That's awesome. But for everyone else who knows 3D or whatever, 2D, is going to say like, okay, yeah, that's cool, but they're not really going to get it. Then everyone else who doesn't work in that industry are going to be completely oblivious like what that is. Okay, you need to kind of break it down into a really obvious, approachable wording that people can understand. So by saying that I do digital portraits of beautiful women, or however you want to put it, I won't like elaborate and go into it, but by being clear about what you are and what you're seeking, it means that people are able to resonate with that, they're able to associate with you with that, they're able to place you in that category. Now, at the same time, like I said, like LinkedIn, everything else, you have a very limited amount of real estate space to kind of really explain who you are without going to your bio. So when you're scrolling through names, you want something that recruiters, everyone else is going to be able to find, as well as you be searchable for. So let's say that you do effects. I'll use effects because I do a lot of that. If you were to use a lot of keywords to make yourself meta searchable, this is very important. If you say, I am, and for instance, that there's one thing that you're really popular with, let's say Krakatoa. Okay, Krakatoa is a point rendering system for particles, mainly, a few other things. Now, if you were to say, I'm a Krakatoa specialist, I do particle simulations and dynamics or whatever else. Now, that mightn't sound as cool, but if someone's looking specifically for Krakatoa stuff and they look up technical directors and they find like all these people, and then there's one that actually says Krakatoa, okay, that is the person they're first going to click on and they're probably going to keep going back to. The best analogy I can give is if you go into Rite Aid or any other chemist or drugstore and you got a splitting headache and you go to the medicine cabinet, you're looking at all the pills and one says cures all pains and another one says something similar like cures most symptoms, and then there's one that says for splitting headaches or splitting migraines, cures migraines. Okay, even though probably they're all the same thing, if you're looking at a couple that are very generalized and you have one that says like it speaks to you, it says cures migraines, and you have a migraine, those two pills are probably identical, but you're going to go for the one that spoke to you, that said exactly what you wanted, because even so, you're going to be like, yeah, this one, what if the other one is going to work its way generally through everything? This one is specifically what like it says it's going to do for me. You're going to want to go with that one. Okay, so it's very important to speak out to people, and that's why if you really want a job in a specific place, you do your due diligence. You know what they want. You can customize your reel, your resume, everything to go in and really nail that job by saying, I am this thing that you want. So by defining yourself in the area that you want to be associated with, it's very crucial because it means that they're going to seek you out and they're going to be able to find you and know comfortably that you are the person because you say, I am the Krakatoa expert, or I am the LinkedIn person, or I am a writer for fashion blogs to do with women's winter clothing. Okay, and like whatever it's going to be, but see how specific that is. Like again, I'm just kind of going off the cuff and making this up as I go, but women's fashion, I blog for women's fashion for winter clothing. It's so specific, but during winter, people are looking, they're going to go to that and say, okay, well, I'm looking for clothing for winter. What's out there? Okay, like what cool stuff can I find? By going niche, by going specific, it means that you're going to stand out over someone else who maybe they market themselves or advertise themselves as, I'm a particle expert and I do dynamics or whatever else. You're saying, here's a good example. You can still market yourself identically to how he is, but you're taking one thing and you're owning it. Okay, so if you have two people applying for a job, one says, I'm a particle expert and I do dynamics and I do all this other stuff. You say, I am a Krakatoa expert. I work also with doing a lot of particle simulations and a lot of other stuff. You're defining and owning that one thing. And then you're also saying, yeah, I do the other things. So it's not about limiting your options. But by doing that, it means who are they going to hire? The particle expert or the Krakatoa expert when they want a Krakatoa person? Again, that's why it's also important to figure out what is a good niche. You don't want to just go and learn something without knowing that there's actually a market for it. Now, I say this because it's very easy to say, okay, well, I'm going to go and I'm going to learn Blender, because I know it and I think it's a good choice. But in production, how many places do you know in your city that are Blender studios? Whereas if you were to go to learn Maya or Max or Houdini or Cinema 4D, those are packages that are probably more widely used, and you can find there's more of a market for it. So do your research, and this is something I gave a talk about in Vegas about, was go and look online, look on the job boards, see what there's a big calling for. Now, just because you are an effects person doesn't mean that you can't learn a few other areas. When you're first getting your foot in the door, maybe there isn't as many effects jobs, and you're less likely to get the gig over someone else. However, you know that there is a lot in compositing. And this is actually a situation with someone recently I was talking with where they were wondering whether they should learn more scripting or they should learn more compositing. Actually, I think it was rigging or compositing. So what I said to them is compositing is probably a better option because you're more than likely able to get a job, and you're more than likely be able to transition over more than rigging necessarily. Rigging, for instance, usually is going to be a shorter term gigs, and they're not going to be as needed. In other words, usually you go to a studio, you might rig up some characters, and then you're out. Whereas compositing, you're going to be in there doing look dev, doing a lot of the grunt work, roto, and everything else, but then going through finishing shots and working on shots more consistently. So, for instance, that might be a good way to get your foot in the door if you were to choose between what is a better niche. However, ultimately, you have your bigger game, your longer game that you want to do, but you got to kind of choose strategically where to go. So, obviously, there's a lot to take in, but that is where, finding your niche, and maybe, if you don't have the right niche right now, finding something that you can actually jump on the bandwagon. New software comes out and not many people know how to use it. What if you were the first to jump on and Bifrost for Maya and say, okay, well, I'm going to learn this really well. Substance Painter is another one. Whenever there's new tools, maybe you get in before anyone else and you can kind of begin to own that niche, like Fume Effects for me or other tools out there. By owning it means that, you've established yourself. If someone's looking for an expert, they Google and find you, and you say, I use this software. You don't need to make yourself out to be God's gift to that tool, but you can say, this is my tool that I use it in production. They're going to look to you and associate you with that tool. So I think it's very important just to define yourself so that way others can define you. And that way they're going to think, oh, we need a Bifrost guy. You know what? I saw a video on this Bifrost dude recently. I'm going to check out his stuff. Yeah, he's actually in our city. Let's hire him. Or can we fly him to our city, our country, whatever. And again, that stuff happens all the time. So associating yourself with something that's popular can also be very important. So that way, when people are looking, they're going to find you. So being very searchable as well. So you show up in LinkedIn, you show up in everything else. By owning it means that you are going to be the guy that's going to be favored because you say, I am the Krakatoa person, or whatever it's going to be, the Bifrost person, the character animator, the women's winter fashion blogger, whatever it's going to be. And like I said, lastly, about if you think that you're going to exclude yourself or limit yourself by going niche, you can still say, and I do this a lot, if you were to go for a job and you want to define yourself as one thing, but you also want to keep your options open, you can say that. You can say, I'm an effects guy, I'm a effects technical director, but I also light and I also model. Okay? And by doing that, people are going to say, okay, well, that's awesome. We don't actually need effects right now, but we do need a good lighting and a good modeler. So you would actually fall perfectly into that category. But you need to at least own one of those. If you said, I'm an effects lighting modeler, in other words, I do effects lighting and modeling, that's going to be something they're going to say, well, what are you? Which one are you? What is your strengths? Okay, so you're gonna be lost there by falling back in the miscellaneous. You're not going to be associated with. So own it. Be like, I'm an effects guy, but I also light and I also model. By doing that, they're going to see and want to see your work. They're still going to associate you with that guy does effects or that girl does effects. But you know what? I think he also models too. So that's great because this other guy just does effects. So if he models, then we can use him on other projects whenever there's downtime. Use that triple punch and own that one thing you want to be associated with. Okay. So moving on from there, that is something I do get asked a lot, is what is better, to be a generalist, like a jack of all trades, or to own one specific thing and like be a specialist. And honestly, and this is actually going to sound really counterproductive, and bear with me, but I honestly think that starting out, the best thing you can do no matter what you're doing is to be a generalist, to start out learning everything. And that's because along the way, you might find, and this is me, like I used to be a character animator. I worked with Max Steel and a few other projects back in like the late 90s. And I loved character animation. But I obviously had a big following, a big career in effects. And I had that conversation with some people that, I knew 20 years ago that I really respect, is what should I do? Should I be a character animator or should I be effects? Because I really like animating a lot more than I like effects. And that was the advice I was always given was, you should stick with what you're good at, like what you really stand out as. And obviously you want to do something you're passionate about, that you love doing. But at the same time, by being a generalist, you get a chance to sample everything, to understand how it all works. But more importantly, to try it all out and see where you're good at. You might think initially that I'm a modeler, I really enjoy modeling. And then later you realize, what? I actually really enjoy the texturing aspect of it. Or after I model, I really enjoy just lighting the model and making it look really beautiful, getting nice kicks on the side, doing good key lights, backlights, getting a bit of emotion into my character, even though it's a still model. Over time, you're going to learn what you're good at and what you maybe get more work doing and what you get more recognition doing, and also what you enjoy doing more. So over time, things change. I know plenty of 3D people who end up moving into compositing because they kind of get more of a passion for that over time, or a lot of other areas. So that's important to have, but it also, I think it's great initially starting out to have that, because you'll get a lot more work in the beginning. People aren't going to want to cash in on a effects person or an animator specifically right away. Typically, if you're going to smaller studios, they want you to be able to do everything. I came from the 90s where you would go to studios and you would need to know everything. The first gig I ever did, I came in, I was doing, the first commercial was a talking dog commercial. I had to model the jowls, animate the lips and the jowls moving, then, render all the elements out, work with a compositor. Next gig I did was a fire hydrant print ad, and I had to render out like a 4K image of like this realistic fire hydrant, which I saw in buses all over Sydney, Australia. And it kind of escalated from there. They brought me on for effects because it's something I had a natural talent for, but I needed to know everything. I needed to be able to do logos, and I needed to do hair simulations. I needed to do a lot of different stuff as I went, and slowly I've got more into a niche where I was just doing consistently effects. But I think it's very valuable, and again, something I discuss a lot with a lot of very successful people in visual effects is that a lot of us came from being a generalist, and it's very important to have that grounding so that way you see how it all works. So not only will you find what you're good at, and you'll be able to get more work consistently in the beginning, but it also means that you're able to understand how modeling works, how lighting works, how cameras work, how compositing works. Bit by bit, you understand the entire pipeline, the entire process. It means that when you're working on your work, you know exactly what is going to happen next in the pipeline. So that way you can deliver your work exactly how you needed it to be. Okay, so that way you can prepare all your effects elements, let's say, for the compositor, knowing exactly how they're going to composite it together, what elements they'll most likely need, and be able to talk to them. That's why I also recommend compositors know some 3D, so that way they can have that cross communication. Meanwhile, you know that if you, again, I'll use effects, if you're going to be destroying a building or something, you might need to talk with the modeler in the beginning and say, look, this is what I need. It needs to be built a certain way, so that way it can, break apart realistically. So no open surfaces, or everything's closed surface. Everything's built neatly. Please don't put too much detail into bolts and other things that are going to get not seen and destroyed. Being careful about that and understanding the entire workflow means that you'll be able to be a part of it all and make the machine function a lot more efficiently. Now, obviously, it's going to be counteractive to something I say a lot, which is to go niche, or I have been saying is to go niche and to specialize. Like I said, you can have a natural talent going in, like I did in my first commercial gigs that I would get in the 90s. I would come in for effects. They hired me for effects, but like I said, knowing some other things means, okay, well, this guy's bankable because when we don't have effects gigs, we can still keep him on for other things. So by saying I'm an effects guy, but I also can animate and I also can light and do other stuff, that means great. Okay, well, we can use you in a lot of stuff, but ultimately we've now nailed an effects guy. We've got someone in there that can do effects. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense, but it's all about defining yourself, building that niche. Very, very important, so that way people know how to place you and what to do with you. Now, lastly, the more you define yourself, the more you will be associated with that thing. You look at guys like Paul Dubevic, and he's well known for obviously all the facial scan stuff. He ended up doing a TED talk about it, which is really amazing. Rob Niederhorst, buddy of mine, who is the nuke guru, and gets hired all the time for that stuff. Then you have like guys like Raf Gazzetti. A lot of these guys I'm actually going to be having on the podcast this year, which is going to be awesome. But he's the ZBrush king as far as I'm concerned. Does a lot of stuff for Nomon. Does a lot of training material. He just does phenomenal work. I mentioned Dan Catcher, I believe, who's Dragon Guy. Andrew Kramer, obviously After Effects and a lot of the amazing stuff he does at Video Copilot. Carlos Ingiano for pipeline stuff. There's Anselm, who I interviewed recently for doing effects as well. So lots of different names that you associate with certain things, and by building that name, everything else starts to follow. So consistency, owning it, and defining yourself by something, so that way you have that, not an elevator pitch, but you have that can material, so that way you can be defined in who you are, and so that way people can define you. So very important that you define yourself before anyone else can define you, and by owning it, by being part of that, sticking with it, using key searchable words in all your introductions, being careful of how you introduce yourself, so that way it really resonates with the people. Like I said, rendered beauties or whatever, something like that is going to be cool, but again, it's not going to necessarily resonate with everyone. I know lots of people who do this. It's very common to say, I make dots, instead of saying I am a technical director with 2 Emmys, or whatever it's going to be. You need to define yourself. You need to lock it down and make it something that's easy to communicate. A successful communicator is not someone who uses fancy big words. It's someone who is able to communicate using the words that everyone's going to understand. And in terms of you doing technical stuff, you want stuff that resonates. Key thing here is that you want people to connect the dots with what you're doing, for what you say you do to resonate with them, to associate with you, so that way you can be the one that they think of when they think of that product. When they say we need a Real Flow guy, or we need a Krakatoa guy, Bifrost, whatever it's going to be, your name is what they're going to think of. Very, very important.